Our topic today is the history of cellular life on Earth. We began tackling this question of where did life come from through a video that we saw in class the other day. And if you're interested, you could certainly go back and take a look at the video in a couple of different clips on YouTube. But our goal is to be able to look at the sequence of events that have led up to the type of life we're studying in our biology class today. So I recommend that you pause and get out your timeline in your lab notebook, take out the table of the events in Earth's cellular history, and follow along with those two, the table and your timeline, as we talk about some of the key events. And I have to say that trying to squeeze all of these events into a 10-minute video is really difficult for me. So I'm going to go pretty quickly, but that's probably going to leave a lot of questions from you. And those are some of the things that we can tackle in class when we come together on Thursday. So the first event that we want to look at on our timeline is the formation of Earth. The theory behind where the planet Earth came from is known as the Big Bang Theory. And it's a complex theory, and you have to study a bit of physics to understand how astronomers have been able to measure distance between planets and stars and theorize and look at that evidence to say that the stars are currently moving apart and that at one point all of the matter in the universe was one big ball, and that an explosion of that ball occurred and materials began to move further and further away from a center, and that as they moved further and further away, they were cooling and coalescing, and that's where the matter of our planet came together and Earth was formed. So again, this is probably something that you might have more questions about. We can talk about it a little bit in class, but the details that you'd want to understand about the formation of Earth was that this Big Bang Theory, which you can read a little bit about here, is the explanation for where and how our planet was formed over the course of billions of years. After Earth was formed, the new planet was really different from what our planet is like today. It was really different in the makeup of the atmosphere. And there was a key element that seemed to have been missing from Earth's early atmosphere. You can see here that water and ammonia and carbon dioxide and methane, nitrogen, hydrogen were some of the gases that are currently making up our atmosphere and some of the gases that were thought to be in abundance on primeval or early Earth. And when those gases were exposed to the violent conditions of the early Earth, the lightning strikes, the boiling volcanic activity, the cooling of the planet as it was moving away and expanding in the universe. All this activity led to the formation of organic molecules. These simple molecules exposed to these conditions were found to produce amino acids. So this very basic experiment set up by Miller and Urey provides us with some evidence that if you put these gases together and you expose them to these conditions, organic building blocks can be generated. And you can take a look at these molecules here and take a look at the structure of amino acids and see that indeed an amino acid has all of the elements that we're talking about. And with a little bit, or maybe a lot, maybe millions of years of boiling and electrifying, is enough to bring those simple molecules together. Harry Kroto's video also talked a little bit about the fact that in order to have life as we know it, we need a molecule that can carry genetic information and can transmit genetic information and can form a code in order to hold information about the materials that's building. So while amino acids are important because they are what make up our structures and our enzymes and our bodies today, and genetic information is what carries that code. So once you have the formation of the key building blocks of life, we have to think about how those building blocks come together. Somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago seems to be the first time that nucleic acids and a protein coat and a phospholipid bilayer were able to come together in such a way that the material was protected and able to replicate. And these first primitive, basic prokaryotic cells came into being. I mean, you may not think of a bacteria cell as being related to you, but as we looked at earlier in the year, all living things have DNA. All living things grow and develop, respond to stimuli, and use energy. And by looking at some of the evidence we see in geology, rock formations, we can see that early bacteria, probably bacteria that resembles algae today, were reacting and living and using carbon dioxide and sunlight in order to grow and this picture here shows something called a stromatolite. Stromatolites are piles of dead algae that fossilize over time. So when we look at these ancient fossils, they very much resemble mats and piles of the algae we might see in a pond today. We notice that once these early bacteria began using sunlight and using carbon dioxide in order to produce sugars, the byproduct of the photosynthetic reaction, oxygen, allowed other organisms to begin to use energy more efficiently and begin to perform aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration and the evolution of aerobic cells coincides with a time when oxygen was more available in the atmosphere. And the evidence we have for that is that around 3 billion years ago, we began to see that rock formations showed evidence of rust. Iron oxide is rusting, and when iron is in rocks and it comes into contact with oxygen, it turns a reddish rusty color. So early bacteria underwent photosynthesis. The photosynthesis produced oxygen, and that oxygen led to a pathway that produced an abundant amount of energy, and cells began to grow larger and become more complex. So somewhere around 22 billion years ago, 2.2 billion years ago, we see that simple prokaryotic cells began to grow larger, and in that process fold some of the membranes inside themselves. Maybe that led to the formation of a nuclear envelope. A key theory at the time of where eukaryotic cells came from is called the Endosymbiotic Theory. And this theory states that larger bacteria swallowed or engulfed smaller bacteria, and somehow these smaller bacteria were useful to the larger cell and were able to provide a service or provide a symbiosis, a relationship where the smaller cell was protected and the larger cell benefited from the way that these smaller cells maybe produced energy. We have some evidence that that's probably how mitochondria and chloroplasts became part of larger cells with organelles, eukaryotic cells. We have a little bit of evidence for that as well. Chloroplasts and mitochondria are the only organelles that contain their own ribosomes and have their own DNA. The DNA inside of chloroplasts and mitochondria, if we look at that DNA, there's shared genes with cyanobacteria or photosynthetic bacteria. The genes inside mitochondria are similar to those inside of aerobic bacteria. We also notice that these organelles have a double membrane. So they have an initial membrane that all cells need in order to survive, to be cellular. And they have a second membrane that we believe comes from being engulfed by that larger cell. So we can look at the evolution of eukaryotic cells due to this endosymbiotic theory and begin to understand that cells are becoming larger and more complex. And at that point, as cells are larger and more complex, they can begin to combine and exchange genetic material. And that leads to an explosion of diverse organisms. So as organisms become more and more diverse due to sexual reproduction and the combination of genes, we see a much more diverse type of life, and you see an explosion of life in the ocean, and then life moving on to land, and eventually the evolution of mammals and flowering plants. And we can take a look at each of the major eras of cellular history is kind of marked by the presence of certain organisms. Again, this is a very brief history of cellular life, and we can talk about some of these events in class on Thursday, but I hope this gives you an overview of where cells came from and how we began with molecules, and those molecules combined to make simple bacteria cells, and how some of those simple bacteria cells were able to grow and form relationships and become the types of eukaryotic, sexually producing multicellular organisms that we're studying in class today.